let's get started. So before we get started, so I'd introduce myself. My name is Anthony. My name is Anthony Ramos. I'm the senior accountant at Meetup, and this is the 14th installment in our Dismantling Social Injustice series of Meetup Live events. You may have joined us for previous events in the series where we've covered issues such as mental health, urban policy, equal and civil rights for the transgender community. If so, welcome back. And if this is your first time with us, welcome and thanks for joining this conversation. Our goal is to continue fostering important dialogue through events like these. And in today's installment, we're celebrating National Native American Heritage Month. Special guest Adrienne Keene, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and author of Notable Native People, is here to discuss the invisibility and silencing of Indigenous narratives in popular culture and the importance of including Indigenous perspectives to challenge stereotypes and misrepresentations. Learn how to seek out Indigenous stories and how to unlearn the harmful narratives. But prior to get started, let's go over our event guidelines. And the event guidelines are for the video. This event will be recorded. You will not appear in the video. The events also be muted, so your audio will be muted during the event. And if you have any questions, it will be open Q&A at the end of the discussion as well, where you can ask your questions in the chat at the bottom of your screen. And closed captioning is available. To turn it on, click on the live transcription icon at the bottom of your screen and select your preference. The agenda for this meeting, this discussion will be, we'll start off with the introduction to our speaker, Adrienne Keene, followed by discussion, and we'll end it off with the Q&A session. All right. So hi, Adrienne, welcome.
Hello.
No worries.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Thanks for joining us today. And before we get into our discussion, how about we start off with a quick introduction for yourself to our attendees.
Sure. Sio Nagad, Adrienne Keene Dakodoa, G Chalagihi Ayeli, G Anigisqua, Galonige de la Jutla Ginela, Tongva Una Jeligohi Ginela, Brown University or Junotelo Kwasti Galali di Wodige. Hi, everyone. I'm Adrienne Keene. I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, Bird Clan. I currently live in what is known as California on the homelands of the Tongva people in what is known as Los Angeles. And I am a faculty member at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island in American Studies and Ethnic Studies. I'm also a writer and a blogger, a podcaster. I have a podcast called All My Relations, a blog called Native Appropriations, and recently just authored a book called Notable Native People. So I am someone who cares very deeply about the ways that Native people are represented in popular culture and changing the misrepresentations and stereotypes and narratives that we have of Indigenous people through history to today. So I'm really excited to talk with you today.
Thank you. So before we get into today's discussion is broken into 3 buckets. First, we're going to talk about where we are today, followed by the history, how we got to where we are today, what were the contributing factors, and lastly, we can do what we can do to positively impact the future. All right. So Adrienne, in your book, you write about the invisibility and silencing of Indigenous narratives in the media. So I guess, can you expand on some of the narratives?
Sure. So when we talk about Indigenous people and what is currently known as the United States, we're talking about an incredibly diverse group of people. There are 577 federally recognized tribes and hundreds more state recognized and non-recognized communities. And that's just in like the continental US. And then there are dozens more in the state of Alaska Native communities. And then in Hawaii, we have Kanaka Maoli, which are the Indigenous people of Hawaii. So when we're talking about Native narratives, it is a huge diversity of perspectives that we're encapsulating in that. But the reality is that for today, the majority of the time, what we experience are either misrepresentations and stereotypes or complete erasure. So there have been a bunch of studies that have looked at the representation of Native peoples across different sectors. And there's a great organization called Illuminative that worked with this research project called Reclaiming Native Truth. And in that project, they did some research to find that Native people are less than 1%, usually even less than 0.5% of representation in really important places like Congress, where we only have 2 Native, or we could talk a little bit more about that, but we only have a couple Native Congress people there. It was 0.36% of representation in newspapers, 0.34% at the federal bench in terms of judges and judicial representation, and then 0% in TV news, things like that, where these are spaces where Indigenous folks are completely erased, where lots of important decisions are being made. And then on top of that, we have all of the public representations like the mascots of different sports teams or the stereotypical culturally appropriated products that you can buy in stores, Halloween costumes, all of these kind of misrepresentations. So a lot of the work that I try to do is to disrupt all of that and bring us into a more true representation of Indigenous communities in our complexities and diversity and our modernity, because so many of these narratives also place us in the historic past or as extinct. So that's why I'm so passionate about trying to disrupt that and talk about how not only have Native people always been here, we are still here and we will always be here.
Yes, on behalf, so how would you say the narrative influenced where we are today?
Yeah, I think the way, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of the historical context, but Indigenous folks have always had representation, meaningful representation in all sectors. It just hasn't really been talked about. And Indigenous knowledges have sustained us on these homelands for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, meaning that we as Indigenous people know how to live in good relation with the lands that we're on. And that knowledge can be carried through into all sectors like science and education and environmental stewardship. All of these things Indigenous peoples should have influence on. But I think the reality is that all of these narratives of erasure and misrepresentation have resulted in a society that doesn't acknowledge the either existence or contributions of Indigenous people.
And as we just move into the historical, more of the historical background and how did we get there, I guess how did we get there, and can you share some historical background around representation that has led us to where we are today?
Sure. So what is currently known as the United States is a settler colonial society. And so you'll probably notice that I keep using the language what is currently known as, and that to me is an important turn of phrase to use because it acknowledges that these lands in what is currently known as the United States were not always known as the United States, and also gives opening that they may not always be known as the United States. So there was something before and there may come something after. So in the lands of what is currently known as the United States, we are a settler colonial society. And what that means is that a group of colonizers arrived to these lands and attempted to destroy everything that was here in order to replace it with a new nation state built on top of already existing societies and nations, Indigenous societies and nations. And so that means that the settlers have never left these lands. There's no sort of post-colonization in the context of what is currently known as the United States. And I give that background to say that in order to justify that dramatic loss of land and life, the Indigenous people of these lands had to be painted as culturally inferior, as less than human, as unworthy of their land and life. And so because of that, representations have been used to feed into that narrative of Indigenous people being savage or childlike, or as being deeply connected to the earth, meaning that anything that if you had access to the earth, the peoples kind of went away with that. So early on, some of the earliest images to come out of the quote unquote new world were dramatic renderings of indigenous peoples that made them look really almost alien and like monsters. And those were being sent back to Europe as representations of the peoples here. So from the earliest days of the Boston Tea Party with the colonists dressed up as quote unquote Mohawk Indians in order to throw the tea in the harbor. And that was to kind of represent that sort of wild, unbridled by society sort of spirit, which is a very big stereotype of Native folks. So there's things from the Boston Tea Party, which is early on, to things like Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which were these shows that folks could come see that had reenactments of Indian wars and things in the shows. And on in advertising, in television, every kind of space of media, there have been representations of Native peoples from the earliest times in the US. And this has laid the groundwork for the narrative of Native peoples that I've reiterated a couple of times in terms of us being less than human, savage, uncivilized. That has just been laid through all of these representations in media, advertising, whatever it is, from the earliest days of the United States.
So we discussed more of the historical background and how we got there. Just can you discuss what are some of the positive strides we've made as a society in the past year in terms of representation?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about a little bit of, so that's like the oldest historical kind of representations, but then if we get into more throughout the years, so like 1800s-ish, that was the sort of Wild West show, the Native peoples being really tied to nature and those sorts of things. And then as we move forward, we can think about the representations and things like Hollywood Westerns that really painted the West and Natives as this kind of like unconquered, wild frontier. And those messages of cowboys and Indians get really integrated into people's ideas of what Native peoples are. And then in the 1960s and around the kind of civil rights movement, that's when we see the emergence of Red Power movements and Native peoples starting to take back space in social justice movements, in thinking about creating our own narratives, our own movies, our own TV shows. A lot of those seeds were planted in the kind of 1960s Red Power era. And that's where we start to see Native folks come together in a united pan-tribal way for the first time in a lot of ways. So occupation at Alcatraz Island is one example of that, of Natives from all different communities coming together. And so that started to shift the way that Native folks were portrayed in the media too, was during that time of growth and visibility. We could talk about any kind of era in US history and the ways that things have shifted and changed, but we're entering into, in the last few years, a really important time where largely through access to social media and the internet, Native folks have been able to start creating media that is for us and by us. And to have access to kind of a collective voice to be able to actively push back on misrepresentation. So starting about a decade ago, when I started my blog, Native Appropriations, that was during the time of like Tumblr and folks really starting to have these important social justice conversations with each other. And so Native folks suddenly could respond immediately when celebrities were wearing headdresses for music festivals or at Halloween or wherever it was, or when things like Disney's The Lone Ranger came out, we could speak back immediately to how Johnny Depp's Tonto was incredibly offensive, and the way he was talking was in the character was something that was really harmful to Native peoples. So using the internet became a way for Native folks to both push back and challenge these stereotypes, make petitions, make direct pleas to companies, but then also start producing our own media and our own narratives in ways that we hadn't been able to before. So 10 years ago, I was writing a ton about Indian mascots and things like the Washington football team, Halloween costumes, whatever it was, but I didn't actually think that I was going to see substantive change in any of those areas in my lifetime. But in the last couple of years, we've just started to see these misrepresentations fall one by one. And a lot of that is due to the momentum gained by the Black Lives Matter movement. So as I mentioned, Native folks have been fighting these misrepresentations for decades and decades. But as the movements around Black Lives Matter in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, there started to be a lens on marginalized communities and recognizing that things like the Washington football team name were not going to fly. Things like dressing up as a marginalized group for Halloween wasn't acceptable. And so we've just had these like rapid fire things that have changed. So Washington football team, things like the Land O'Lakes butter label, which has always been the bane of Native people's existence, got changed very quietly, just sort of, they changed it. The ski resort that is very famous that starts with an S, which is what I consider a racial slur for Native women, that's changing its name. The Cleveland Indians is finally doing away with Chief Wahoo for good and changing their name. So it's just been a rapid fire fall of these, and Columbus statues. I could keep going, but in addition, we now have things like Reservation Dogs, which is a TV show that stars all Native people and has a Native director and Native producers and an entirely Native writers room. And that was something that would have been unfathomable a decade ago when we were just excited to see a non-stereotypical Native representation on a TV show. So we also have Rutherford Falls, which is another mainstream TV show that has a huge Native presence and a Native showrunner. So, and there's more coming down the pipeline that I've heard about that haven't been made public yet. So the last few years has seen leaps and bounds, but it has been the groundwork that's really been laid by Native communities and activists since like the 1950s and 60s that this work has been going on.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, like within the last few years, there's been lots of leaps and bounds or positive strides towards the misrepresentation. Why do you believe it's taken so long for the change to occur within the narrative, or what's causing such the most recent strides recently?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think it is coupled with the momentum around Black Lives Matter and a lot of racial reckoning that's been happening. But the challenge with Indigenous peoples is that in order to recognize our existence and our continued existence and our claims to these lands as the first people of these lands, it has to also come with it a recognition that what is currently known as the United States was founded on the genocide and attempted eradication of Indigenous peoples. So it's a complicated thing for folks in the US to both acknowledge and recognize and celebrate Indigenous peoples, but you can't have that without also acknowledging and recognizing the atrocities that have been committed against us throughout history. So I think that's part of why it's taken so long to get to this point, is that there's that really uncomfortable tension that exists of celebrating while not necessarily doing the work that needs to be done around acknowledging and reconciling the historic past.
Yeah, and as we're discussing more of the historical background, you mentioned the Red Power movement. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that was?
Sure. So during the 1960s, as the civil rights movement was happening, as there were conversations around Black Power, there started to be conversations and movements within Indigenous communities to think about how we fit into the civil rights narrative. And it's challenging because Indigenous identity is not one that is just a purely racialized identity. We are citizens of sovereign nations. So we have citizenship in our tribes, which our tribes experience a nation to nation relationship with the US government. And so in a lot of ways, our rights are inherent to who we are as Indigenous peoples, and they exist until Congress comes to take them away. And it's just a different relationship to the federal government than other marginalized racial groups in the US. And I'm probably getting too academic about it, but the bottom line is for Native folks, the Red Power movement was the first time that a lot of tribes came together across tribal, Native people came together across tribal lines to join together to have a vocal voice on a lot of these issues. And during that time, the American Indian movement, AIM, really rose to prominence as well, and was responsible for a lot of takeovers and occupations of different offices and places like Alcatraz, like I mentioned. So that time really stirred a lot of momentum for these collective movements of Indigenous peoples from that time on. So it was a really important turning point to think about how our communities could come together to have a collective voice on issues that affected all of us.
Thanks for elaborating. I know also as we spoke about the historical background, and now we look more towards the future and how we can move forward based on some of the positive strides more recently. But I guess how can we right some of these wrongs, or what we can learn from this history as well?
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that we need to listen to Indigenous people. And I think across any sector really, that is a place where Indigenous voices and perspectives need to be recognized and valued. And if we're thinking of the realm of media representations, and I'm someone who, the idea, we talk a lot in kind of the media world of this idea of representations matter. And I obviously believe very strongly in that, but I also don't think representations are the thing that's going to save us all. I think that it's important for helping people understand possibilities, see themselves reflected, to be able to imagine and dream a future beyond settler colonialism. Representations are really important in that sense. And so I think we can correct a lot of this through just letting Native peoples tell our own stories, and having power actually shifted back into the hands of Indigenous folks. So it's not enough anymore to hire one Native person on a TV show in the writer's room. It really needs to be something where the reins are in the hands of Indigenous peoples. And if we're thinking about climate catastrophe, like, we need to be looking to Indigenous communities who've known for thousands of years how to live on these lands in a good way. And right now, Indigenous peoples hold 80% of the world's biodiversity on our lands. And so that's something important to think about as well. So I think uplifting Indigenous voices for settlers, for folks who are descendant from the people who came to these lands during post-colonization, there is a lot of work to be done internally of self-educating, of learning about these processes, of thinking about how to be a good accomplice or a good co-conspirator to Indigenous communities, and reading as much as possible, also thinking about the kind of tangible ways that you can be in supportive of your local Native communities. But I think it really comes back to listening to Indigenous people, letting us, like, shifting the power back into Indigenous hands, and uplifting Indigenous voices and Indigenous stories.
And can you also elaborate on biodiversity? I think what it means.
Sure. Basically, that just means that if we're thinking of the world and the plants and the animals and the non-human relatives that we need in order for our entire ecosystem to function, the lands that are controlled by Indigenous peoples. So in what is known as the U.S., that would be our reservation homelands, the Hawaiian homelands, things like that. In other nations around the world, that looks differently, but the lands that are controlled by Indigenous peoples hold the most diversity of plants, animals, non-human relatives, the things that we need to sustain in order for us to continue to exist as human beings. The vast majority of it is held on Indigenous lands. And so that's why protecting those lands, looking to Indigenous peoples for knowledge and ways forward becomes even more important.
Thanks. And I know as we're focusing more on the future and how to right some of the wrongs, we mentioned to listen to Indigenous people and whatnot. How can we seek out some Indigenous stories or what, and we can learn from these stories?
Yeah, so the narratives we're taught in school are incredibly harmful about Indigenous peoples for the most part. We don't learn in public schools, don't learn the true stories of Indigenous peoples, of true history in a lot of ways. So I think doing self-education on both historical and contemporary Native folks is really important. And I mentioned a couple of TV shows that are recent examples, but there's also an incredible world of Native podcasts, of Native artists, of Indigenous writers. So I think just being intentional about the spaces that you are interested in, that you occupy, what are Indigenous folks doing in that area, in that sector? And I have found a lot of amazing things happening on social media platforms like Instagram, being able to connect with Native artists and Native writers, Native organizations, and learn from one another in those spaces. So I think it's just a matter of tuning in and recognizing your own blind spots, recognizing where you might not have been intentional about seeking out narratives, and then looking for ways to replace those misrepresentations that you've always held. So like with my book with notable Native people, a lot of what I was doing with that was trying to disrupt a lot of those misrepresentations. So something like that is a place to start of how to seek out different stories that you don't have access to. But the narratives and things are out there. It's just a matter of doing a little extra work to find them and being willing to go down the rabbit holes of like, oh, if I like the All My Relations podcast, what else is recommended to me on iTunes? Let me find some more Indigenous podcasts that way. Or if I follow Sterling Harjo, the director of Reservation Dogs on Instagram, who else does he promote? Who else does he share their posts? Who are the actors in the show that I can follow? Just being able to make those connections and seek out new stories because they really are out there and are ready for folks to be engaged with.
Thanks for sharing that. And as we're discussing how to seek out these stories, just to point out one of the questions that came in, I mean, I already briefly suggested as well, but what's a respectful way to just like to reach out and try to connect with some of these tribes also? And you mentioned some podcasts and stuff, but maybe any additional information on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's kind of the first place for non-Indigenous folks to start is to figure out whose land you are on. That's like a very basic first step. And there are a couple of ways you can start that process. There's a website called native-land.ca. And on that website, you can put in your location and it'll give you the names of the people whose land you're on. And then the next step is to seek out what they are doing today, because chances are they are still engaged in all kinds of work and practices and living their lives as Indigenous peoples. Maybe they have been displaced to other homelands, but they're definitely still here. So looking to see what kind of events are being sponsored by the local community. If you're in urban areas, there are often in big cities, there are urban Native communities. And this is something that came from the federal relocation programs in the 1960s. So along that time that we were talking about with Red Power and things like that, there was an effort to try and move Indigenous peoples away from their homelands and into urban centers as a means of assimilation, thinking that they would no longer have ties with their communities. So as a result of that, what actually happened is that the Indigenous peoples in these cities found each other and started urban Native centers and have built up amazing communities in those spaces. So cities like New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Cleveland, Minneapolis, all of these places have really strong, Seattle have very strong Indigenous presence. So there are always events and things that can be open to the public, places where you can engage. But I think the big thing is knowing that building relationships with Indigenous communities is something that takes time and is something that involves a level of reciprocity, meaning that you can't just come to a space and expect that Indigenous peoples are going to be willing to engage with you and welcome you in, that it's something that takes a process of building up that trust and respect and may take a very long time. But there are always ways that folks are welcome, the public is welcomed into Indigenous spaces, and it's just a matter of seeking those out and being willing to be a part of them.
Thank you for sharing that. As we're discussing some of the resources that we have in your book, I guess if you can just discuss some of the leaders that stand out most, I guess, in your book and what we can learn from them as well.
Sure. So my book has 50 different profiles, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, the diversity and sheer amount of Native peoples in what's currently known as the US means that that is just a small, impossibly tiny subsection of the number of people that could be in there. But what I really tried to do with pulling together that list of 50 was to offer a diverse cross-section of all of the different spaces and places where work is happening and has happened in Indigenous communities. So there are people in there like historic folks like Sequoia, who comes from my own community, who was the creator of the Cherokee syllabary. So the written language for the Cherokee people that allowed for us to read and write in our language. And he created that from scratch on his own in the 1800s. So there's stories like him, and we still today are using the syllabary. It's available. It's one of the 40 languages available on Apple products, things like that. And that was started with his legacy. So there are historic folks like that that might be a little more known to people. But then I also tried to highlight just community folks who are doing important revitalization and reclamation and preservation work in their communities, like Paul John, who is a Yupik language and cultural practitioner, who he was responsible for passing on teachings of his community, for traveling to different museums around the world to look at the artifacts that they, in many cases, had illegally collected, to offer guidance on what communities they came from, to teaching young people. So there's a really wide range, and each of the folks in there offers really important lessons on how to relate to one another, how to learn about Indigenous knowledges, and all the ways that these diverse folks have been able to contribute across the board.
Thank you so much for sharing that as well. And as that wraps up our discussion, I'd like to jump into Q&A. I believe we have some questions that came in, and for our attendees, if you have any questions, feel free to drop it in the Q&A section below. Some of our questions that came in is, can you talk about when cultural appreciation crosses the line into cultural appropriation? What's your recommendation for ways we can respectfully appreciate Indigenous cultures?
Yes, such a good and important question. So I am someone who writes a lot about cultural appropriation, have been writing, oh, there's my dog, that's Mochi. Have been writing about cultural appropriation for a long time. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what cultural appropriation actually is, why it's harmful, those kinds of things. But the bottom line is that cultural appropriation is really taking from a culture that's not your own, with no kind of respect to where those practices or designs or whatever it is came from, and with ignoring the power structures that are in place. And we could dive into definitions and what it means for hours, but the bottom line is there's this great tweet from 2015 by a Twitter user, Jay the Nerd Kid, that I use in all of my presentations. And basically the bottom line is how the tweet is how to respectfully partake in someone else's culture. And it's 3 steps. And the first is be invited, which is very important. 2, follow your host's lead. And 3, respect their boundaries. So if you're engaging or want to engage in some sort of cultural practice from Indigenous communities, following those 3 steps actually is really helpful. So if you are saying, this is like the dramatic example, but I want to wear this war bonnet to a music festival. Were you invited to wear that war bonnet? Probably not. Did you follow a host's lead? Did someone show you how to wear it? The respectful protocol to follow around it? Did you earn it? And did you respect their boundaries? So if Indigenous communities are telling you, hey, that's off limits, that's something that is just for us, that's something that is sacred, that's something that's important for our ceremony, did you respect that boundary, or was it something that you went ahead with anyway? So I think, shout out to Jay the Nerd Kid, I think those are really clear and easy guidelines to follow.
Thank you. And as we move on with Q&A, do you have any comments on differences between portrayal of Native peoples, the repercussions this may have had in different areas colonized by different European powers, such as England, Spain, and Portugal?
I mean, I think, yeah, that's another big topic that we could talk about, but I do think it is important to recognize that different communities throughout what is currently known as the US experienced colonization differently and continue to experience it differently, depending on who were the first European colonizers to come in contact, as well as when first contact occurred. So if we're talking about on the East Coast where I usually live, the tribal communities out there have been experiencing colonization since the 1500s, the early 1600s, whereas in Hawaii, Captain Cook didn't make it to the islands until 1776. So that's like a huge difference of time and experience. So I think because of that, it means that portrayals and representations look different as well. And as well as the ways that communities have been able to maintain and revitalize their cultural practices in those regions also looks different because of those timelines and types of colonization that was experienced. And here in California, we have like the entire mission system, which was a absolute genocide and atrocity that we still celebrate in schools and teach in California school curriculum, things like that. So it really is, there are differences regionally depending on how colonization was and is experienced.
Thanks. And for the next question, are all Native people accepted in their communities if the person identifies as an LGBTQS individual? And are there any drug alcohol support groups available for Native people?
Both important questions. So in terms of the LGBTQIA Two-Spirit plus community, historically, our tribal communities were incredibly understanding and open around gender diversity and sexuality. Like that was not something that was a problem in our communities. So in a lot of cases, Two-Spirit people or folks who were gender diverse didn't really fit into the binary. It wasn't a problem. It was a celebrated role. It was someone who was had an important place in the community, who was able to live the way that they wanted to live. It wasn't a big, complicated controversy, and that the exclusion of people who identify in the kind of LGBT plus community was something that came through colonization, was something that came through missionaries specifically sent to Native communities with the sole purpose of trying to stamp out those practices. So as a result, a lot of our communities are still dealing with the legacies of that colonization. And so I would like to say that that Two-Spirit and LGBT folks are really accepted in all of our communities, but unfortunately that isn't the case because of the deep and ongoing impacts of colonization. So there's a lot of beautiful work being done around reclaiming and revitalizing those teachings and practices. There are amazing organizations that are doing work to support folks from those communities within their Native communities and things like that. So there are definitely spaces that are super inclusive and very welcoming, and tribal communities that are inclusive and welcoming, but there are others that still have a lot of unlearning to do from 500 years of colonization. And in terms of drug and alcohol support, yes, there are plenty of organizations that are there to help folks from Indigenous communities to work through that as well.
Thank you. And for the next question, what's your opinion about land acknowledgements and the best practices to make them meaningful?
Oh, I have so many opinions about land acknowledgements. That could be a whole nother talk. So the short version is, I think land acknowledgements, which is the idea of acknowledging whose homelands you occupy at the beginning of an event or on a website or as an institution or whatever it is. I think it comes from a good place. I think it's something that is important to do that work of figuring out whose land you're on. But I think in the past couple of years, as they've become more widely spread, it's become a checkbox that doesn't really have a lot of meaning behind it at all. So I often quote two Native folks when I'm talking about this. One is an Anishinaabe scholar from what's currently known as Canada named Hayden King. And he wrote an article where he said that he regretted helping his institution folks would include some variation of, and this is what that compels me to do at the end of it. So moving it from just an acknowledgement to some sort of action. Because there's another Native scholar named Kacha Baldi, who is Hoopa, and she said on Twitter or Instagram one time, land acknowledgement is good, but land back is better. So the question becomes, how do we move it from a sort of checkbox, like did that, now I'm a good person, into something that has meaningful action behind it? And I think that's where the conversation needs to go. And also that the land acknowledgement itself shouldn't actually be the first step. In order to write a meaningful land acknowledgement, there should be a relationship with the tribe that you are acknowledging. And that's something that could take years and years and isn't just an easy sort of quick process. So I think many people rush to get one, slap it on their website, read it at the beginning of an event and think that they've done the work. But the reality is that the work needs to come before and definitely after the writing of that acknowledgement.
Thank you. And let's move on to the next question. Next one is, what does true spirit mean?
Oh, very good question. I was just throwing that around like it's a well-known term. So that's actually something that came out of Indigenous LGBT gatherings in the 1990s. And I am not an expert on the sort of origins of the term and where it comes from, which communities it specifically comes from. So I have, to plug it, I have an episode on my podcast called Indigiqueer. So my podcast is called All My Relations. There's a specific episode called Indigiqueer with two writers, First Nations writers from what's currently known as Canada, Billy Ray Belcourt and Joshua Whitehead. And they, in our conversation, go in depth into the origins of the term and the ways that people identify and who might identify as two-spirit and who does not. But basically, it's the idea that a person encapsulates multiple gender identities in their spirit, that they have male and female qualities or multiple gender, however you want to define it. So it's a term that also, I will say, is for Indigenous people. So that's one of those like invitation boundaries kind of conversation. Is it something that came out of Indigenous traditions and teachings and is for Indigenous people to use and identify that way, and is not something for non-natives to use as part of their identity?
Thank you. And for the next question, there's so much work to be done on educating, and I'd like to know if you think the education system will start to adapt.
I have mixed feelings about if I have hope in the current colonial education system. I do think that there is definitely progress being made. I gave the example of the state of California that we had the mission curriculum, which really glorified the mission system and Junipero Serra and completely ignored the genocide of California Indigenous people that went along with it. I'm someone who in 4th grade had to build a mission as part of a mission day at school. So that kind of level of erasure is so deep in our curriculums. But in California, there's been a huge push and movement to reform that curriculum. There is new curriculum being written that will be taught in public schools in California around the truth of the mission system. We also in California passed a law requiring ethnic studies in all public schools. So the challenge then becomes who has a say in writing the actual changed curriculum, and the implementation is the challenging part as well. So it doesn't just matter what the curriculum is, it matters how it's taught. And I think a lot of teachers, even well-meaning teachers, don't have the skill set to be able to have these tough conversations in a generative and meaningful way, because they also have been raised and taught and educated in this system that perpetuates all of these stereotypes and myths and problematic portrayals of Native peoples. So I think that a lot of the power comes in the outside of school spaces and the parents who are changing the narrative for their children, who are seeking out the Indigenous books to raise them on, having the tough conversations about racism and colonialism. I think that's where a lot of change can happen as we slowly work through the more substantive change in school systems.
Yes, and as we continue with our Q&A, we have a lot of good questions here coming in. So the next one, Indigenous enterprise is on stage in NYC. Is this an acceptable means to open and expose a culture in a real sense of existence? Traveling throughout the USA, I always ask, where are the Indigenous people? Response, we don't know what the names Indigenous and the Native people. Does the census represent an accurate count of these persons?
So the question is, does the census represent an accurate
account of these persons? Yes.
There are scholars, like one of my my good friends, Desi Small Rodriguez, is a sociologist, and her mentor from undergrad, Matthew Snip, is another demographer, sociologist. They are the leading experts on thinking about census data in regards to Indigenous peoples. So I would point you to them. Desi is at UCLA. Dr. Snip is at Stanford, so they have some good writings on it. The census has never been good at capturing race and ethnicity data. NPR Code Switch also has a good couple of episodes about census data. The challenge is that for Indigenous peoples, as I said, this is a citizenship identity. So we are citizens of sovereign nations. And unfortunately, the narrative in a lot of the US is that Native American is a racial category just like other races. And so a lot of folks have family stories or or lore of a long lost Native ancestor, and they feel comfortable checking the box for Indigenous. For the Latino community, as we know, the data is collected in such a strange way in terms of the like, are you Hispanic or Latino? Yes, no. And if you say yes, then you have to check a racial box, but the racial boxes are American Indian, Alaska Native, Black, white, like there's or Asian, or Pacific Islander. So there's a lot of Latino folks are Indigenous from places other than what is currently known as the United States. And so that should be a valid identity and a way to identify, but currently the boxes then throw all of those folks in with American Indian people who are from these lands. So it becomes a big complicated mess. And unfortunately, that's where so much money is allocated through census data, so much funding work, everything is done through that. And so it becomes really challenging in trying to parse out what's going on there. So I would say not super accurate, but don't take my word for it. Look to amazing people like Desi Small Rodriguez and Matthew Snip.
Thank you. And as we continue the Q&A, what is a constructive way to respond to the question I get fairly often of, you don't look like an Indigenous person?
Something I have a little bit of experience with. I have like the snarky answers, which is basically like, well, what does a Native person look like? Like, what are you actually trying to say there? Or I have deeper answers about how blood quantum, like this idea that you can quantify what percentage Native you are, is something that literally came directly from attempting to eradicate Indigenous people and from colonizers. It doesn't come from within our communities. My community doesn't use blood quantum for tribal citizenship. So if you have a Cherokee ancestor on our base roll, you are Cherokee. There's no question of that. So I often respond with a lot of questions to people, and it's taken a lot of practice through the years because it's a very hurtful comment where it doesn't matter what I look like. My tribe accepts me. I am a citizen enrolled in my tribe. My mom, my grandma, my great grandma, all are Cherokee women. My grandma grew up on allotment land in Oklahoma, went to Indian boarding school, like all of these things I can list off. And so it doesn't actually matter how I look. I have those connections and ties to my community. So I usually respond with, what do you mean by that? Or what does a Native look like? And kind of get people to start unpacking their own assumptions with that statement. And then I usually give the shorthand version of how blood quantum is a colonizer concept and was created to try and breed out Indigenous people. And it's something that we don't, we shouldn't rely on at all today.
As we begin to wrap up our Q&A, for one more last question, what stories need to be told about health justice for Indigenous communities?
About health justice?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, so many stories. Because in terms of the way that Indigenous people have been treated by the medical system in the US is just along the lines of every other atrocity. So as part of our treaty agreements with what is currently known as the US, healthcare was one of the things that was promised for our communities in exchange for giving up land. And as a result, we have something called the Indian Health Services, which is a federal program that is supposed to provide healthcare for Indigenous peoples in these lands, but it is funded at the lowest level, even below prison healthcare. So IHS is notoriously underfunded, notoriously has huge wait times, has not enough resources to serve Indigenous communities. And as a result of colonization, our communities have a lot of health needs in terms of rates of diabetes and heart disease and things are very high because our traditional foodways were eradicated and replaced with processed foods from colonization. We don't have access to our lands in the way and waters in the ways that we should to have traditional subsistence hunting and fishing and things and gathering. So the need is really high for healthcare in communities, in Native communities, and is not being met by Indian Health Services. There's sometimes one doctor for an entire reservation. In Alaska, the rural Indigenous villages are so spread out, they're often only accessible by seaplane. And so there are many villages that don't have healthcare until someone comes on a rotating sort of basis. So it's a huge need. And one that there are also amazing people working on trying to figure out better ways to serve our people. There are a lot of tribally controlled clinics now where, like, the Cherokee Nation has an amazing medical center in Tahlequah that serves our people. And during the pandemic, they had more vaccines than people in our nation, so started vaccinating the local non-Native community. So there are definitely examples of tribes taking back control over their healthcare and doing really, really cool things.
Thanks again. And as we have time for one last question during our Q&A, so it's a two-part. I just purchased your book, and are there any Indigenous-owned news media outlets? I know you mentioned a few, so I guess if you could just remind our attendees some of the resources you previously mentioned also.
Sure. In terms of news outlets, the biggest one is Indian Country Today, which is an online newspaper. They also have sort of news broadcasts. There's an amazing radio show that's been going on for decades called Native America Calling, that is a great resource in terms of news and current events in Indigenous communities. And then most tribes have their own tribal newspaper. So that is another way that if you are on a tribe's homeland subscribing to their newspaper, you might get some like local gossip and events and things that don't make sense, but it also is a way to keep up with what's going on in those spaces. And I will say, like, since the question started with buying the book, there also are Native-owned bookstores that you can support. They're the kind of flagship Native bookstore in Minneapolis is called Birch Bark Books, and it's owned by Louise Erdrich, who is an Anishinaabe author. So Birch Bark Books is a place to support. Red Planet Books and Comics in Albuquerque, New Mexico is another one. Namea Hawaii in Hawaii is another one. And there are a couple more that I am blanking on, but supporting Native-owned bookstores is also a great way to have access to Native authors and titles, and also support a Native bookstore too.
All right, awesome. Well, Adrienne, thank you so much today for your time and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having me. I know I like ramble a lot, but I would be happy to talk more about any of these things with anybody. So yeah, I appreciate the invitation.
No problem. It's great having you as well, of course. And before we go, I'd like to share a few slides here as well. So Adrienne's book is here, and you can also see a copy for the link of it in the chat section. And to become, Meetup organizer, find others who share interest. There's a save 30% on your first subscription code here, meetupsavings.com. And you can also check us out on our podcast at meetuppodcast.com, or scan the QR code right here as well. And that is all. Thank you everyone again for joining, and Adrienne, thanks again for your time.
Thank you.